Naomh agus fáilte arás to the Crazy House Prices podcast with me, your host, Ciarán Mulqueen. And in this podcast, in general, we talk about everything housing market and some helpful episodes as well. But today's episode with Dr. Lorcan Sirr is all about the stats and the figures behind housing, because we hear a lot about, how much housing is being delivered. But my question is always, well, actually, how much of that housing is available for people to buy? And in this episode, you'll learn exactly how much it is. And spoiler alert, it's not a whole lot. So just before we get into it, massive thank you to my patrons for supporting the Instagram page, for supporting the podcast. If you would like to become a patron, just go on to patreon.com/Crazy House Prices, or go to the link in my bio in my Instagram, or click on the show notes of this episode and the link will be there. My patrons are phenomenal. They're amazing. They've supported the page from pretty much the get-go, and there's lots of bonus exclusive content over on the Patreon. We do Q&As, get experts on, all that kind of stuff. So in exchange for about €3 a month, you get a lot of extra content in return. But anyway, on to this episode with Lorcan Sirr. I'm not going to say enjoy, because it's not a very enjoyable episode. You'd probably be prepared to get a bit annoyed and a bit angry, but I think it's important that people are informed on the data behind housing delivery and how much is actually available for people to buy. Hi, I am just going to pause the podcast for a second to talk to you about some sponsors of the Crazy House Prices podcast. This episode is sponsored by Daft.ie. Daft is Ireland's #1 property portal. Daft has the most properties available for sale and rent, and is the preferred national property website amongst consumers in Ireland. So Daft.ie's core vision is to make buying, selling and renting property better for everyone in Ireland. So Daft's mission is to simplify each step of every property transaction in the Irish market to make buying, selling and renting in Ireland simple. That's why Daft.ie build innovative tools like Offers by Daft, an online real-time offers platform that provides never before seen transparency for the Irish consumer when buying a home. Are you looking to buy? Maximise your chances of finding your dream home by visiting Daft.ie, Ireland's #1 property website. Now, today I have Lorcan Sirr back on the podcast. He was here for episode #1, which is still our most downloaded podcast. So welcome back, Lorcan, and looking forward to kind of getting into the numbers of the housing market. I think maybe we could start off with the actually going back to those numbers, how many homes are being built, and then we might chat about, the breakdown as to how many are available and what have you.
Yeah. Hi, Ciarán. Pretty interesting that the first podcast is the most listened to. I think that's just because it was novelty. It's not to do with me.
Not at all. I think people love hearing the figures and the stats and the data, because that's things. Yeah. That's hard data. It's these are facts. They're not people's opinions. And I think that's
when I used to write for when I used to have a column in the Sunday Times, I used to avoid putting in stats and I was kind of doing the readers a bit of a disservice by thinking, they wouldn't be interested or they wouldn't be able to. Actually, readers and podcast listeners love stats and they really get into the nitty gritty. So now when I write articles for the newspapers, I can lash in a lot of stats and the editors don't mind and the readers seem to like it, which is quite good. So the question that there's been loads of stuff. Obviously, housing is the gift that never stops giving. So there's loads of stuff always in the news. But one of the most recent spats that was maybe 6 weeks ago or 2 months ago about the number of houses that we built in 2022. So the government of the CSO, which is under the wing of the Department of Housing, the department that couldn't count houses for years, but the CSO was like an independent arbiter and generally, I think, pretty good. The CSO came out and said we built 29,851, nearly 30,000 houses. That's including apartments and all that kind of stuff last year. And then there's a company called CIS, Construction Information Services, who they make software for building sites, basically construction managers and invoicing and quantity surveying kind of stuff. They came out and they did a trial of what's called the Building Control Management System. That's the official register of when you start to build housing or when you finish it. Now, not one-off houses, they're exempt, but any sort of apartment or terrace house or housing estate, you have to lodge what's known as a commencement notice between 2 and 4 weeks before you start building. That's to let the local authority know what's going on in their area, so they can send out an inspector if they need to, and then you send in a completion certificate, basically, which means a chartered engineer, building surveyor, or an architect looks at the property and says this is built in accordance with standards, and only at that point is it legal to occupy. So the CIS said, no, we didn't build 29.5 or 30,000 houses, we built 23,500 with a difference of about 6,500 or 6,100 houses, and the CSO pushed back and said absolutely no way, that they're wrong and they're missing 6,000 one-off houses. Now, one-off houses are exempt from those requirements for lodging a commencement notice and a completion cert, but we can still account for them. I asked the CIS then to look at where the major differences were spatially across the country between the CSO and their figures. 6,000, given how few houses we build, it's a lot. So the major differences were in the cities, in Dublin, Cork, Galway, Limerick, which means that it wasn't one-off houses. That was the difference between the CSO's 30,000 and the CIS's 23,500, whatever it was, 23,000. So my suspicion is, and it's denied, I think officially, but my suspicion is the way we count houses in Ireland is we count a house is counted as a new house when it's connected to the ESB grid and charged. So in other words, if you went into the house and plugged in your stereo, it would work. Now, there was all sorts of problems before about that, but that's the way we do it. But that doesn't mean that's not the same thing. So a house gets connected or an apartment gets connected to the ESB grid as part of its statutory or its legal requirements under the regulations, if you know what I mean. It doesn't mean only when it's connected to the grid does the surveyor come out or the architect or the engineer and tick the box and say this apartment or house is built in accordance with standards and gives it a certificate of completion, of compliance on completion. So what they've been doing, I think, is they've been counting houses, and particularly apartments. I think it's all about apartments that have been connected to the ESB grid, but aren't legal to occupy because they haven't got a certificate of completion. So I suspect that's what happened last year, and that's the difference between the CIS. So did we build 30,000 houses last year? I say no. The CSO said yes. And, technically we probably built them, but there weren't 6,100 of them weren't legal to occupy, if you know.
There's no one in them. Yeah, there's no one in them.
Can't be, because it's not legal to have anybody in. But yet, like as a structure, they're there. But like there's no point in having a structure that's there that contains apartments or houses if nobody can actually enter them and occupy them.
Well, that's 20% of the total output. So it's not an arbitrary figure. Yeah. And then I guess of those, say 24 or 30,000 houses, how are they broken down then into, how many are social? And I often note that the government say delivered rather than built, because they can say they delivered 30,000 homes or whatever, but that can also include buying existing homes from the market. So how many of those, say 24, 30,000, what's the breakdown then in terms of how many of those are available for me to buy, basically? How many are social and how many are apartments for rent?
Okay, yeah. Now there's a couple of different things here. I suppose the CSO break it down by the building type for a start, for example. Okay, so last year we built what the CSO call a scheme house, is what you and I would call a housing estate or a terraced house. So last year we built 15,000, just over 15,000 scheme houses. So normal houses that people are typically used to buying in Ireland over the years. We built 5,500 one-off houses. They're typically not in urban areas. About 61 of them was in Dublin, for example, last year. But it's generally people with their own land who build a house, and generally in rural areas. And that's been a mainstay of Irish housing since over the last 100 years of the Land Commission and all that kind of stuff. And last year then we built 9,166 apartments. Now the interesting thing about apartments is nowadays not one of them, 99% of them are only available for rent.
Yeah.
And that is up from like in 2017, like not 1917, but in 2017, like 5 years ago, we built about 2,100. And last year we built nearly 9,200 apartments. So we've seen a huge surge in apartments, and of course apartments are only available for rent. So, we have to be very clear about this. A lot of the apartments, or some of the apartments that are built for social housing. So Clued and Respond and all those guys, like Respond, biggest house builder in the country at the moment, they have about 1,500 apartments under construction. So some of the apartments would be for social renting, for de facto council housing. And a lot of it then will be for built to rent with the large institutional funds do that. Now, the interesting thing, so 9,000, keep in your head 9,200 social houses. Out of the 30,000 houses that we built last year, not all of those will come to the market. Now, what I mean by come to the market is they won't appear in your local estate agent window for you to be able to go down and buy as a brand new house. And single houses, so the one-off houses we talked about, they don't really come to the market because people build them for themselves. They're going to live in them. Yeah. They're not going to sell them as a brand new house. And social housing doesn't come to the market either. It's built by Clued, Respond, the local authorities, whatever, and that's kept for them for use of social housing. So on average, for the last 5 years, we have seen 7,500 houses come to the market, come to your local estate agent window every year as new houses. Back in 2017, when Simon Coveney was minister, that was 51% of all houses. So in 2017, over half of every house we built came to the market in an estate agent window. Last year, that was 28%. So just over 1 in 4 of all houses now come to the market. The rest of them are apartments for rent or social housing or one-off housing. So what it means last year, when I kind of crunched the numbers, last year, I think it was about 8,000 houses came to the market last year. I can't remember the exact number, but what it meant though was that if 8,000 houses came to the market and we built 9,200 apartments, for the first time ever, we're building more housing specifically for rent than we are for sale. And that's a huge change in our housing output in 5 years, in a really, really in a short amount of time.
But I guess looking at the other side of that with the apartments, I guess we do need more apartments, and we're told we're told that all the time, because there is so little to rent. And I guess the argument is they wouldn't be built otherwise if it wasn't funds building them, because they're the ones that a bank isn't. And we spoke about this the last time. A bank isn't, like, they're struggling to lend on apartments. It's not like a housing estate where you build phase one, sell them, use that money to build the next phase. They have to build all the apartments in one go. So there's no one really touching them other than the big institutional investors, because they're the ones that can afford it and forward fund the building.
Yeah. Well, let's go back to the premise, your initial premise there, that we need loads more apartments to rent. Like, kind of, do we? There's a huge proportion of people in the private rental sector, and you were probably one of them before you bought your house there, who could afford and wanted to own their own home, right? So why do they need more rental accommodation? And then there's 60,000 households who are on HAP in the private rental sector that should be in council house. But if you take the first cohort, so yourself, when you were in the private rental sector, there's a huge proportion of the private rental sector, people renting, who don't want to rent. It suited them for a while, and now they don't want to rent, but they can't find anywhere to buy. So my argument against that is the private rental sector could arguably be too big at the moment. There's about 21% of all households in the private rental sector. That was in 2016. God knows what it is now. And I think there's a lot of those people who don't need or want to be there. And what we should be doing is building own-door houses for sale. And that doesn't mean low-density sprawl houses. It could be medium to high-density housing. I don't care. We need to build more housing for sale and take them out of the private rental sector. Give them something to buy. Like last year, like I said, 28% of all new houses came to the market. That should be 58%. And then you'd have all those people coming out of the private rental sector buying their own homes. And becoming homeowners in one way, shape or form. You need more houses coming onto the market for people to buy. You don't necessarily need more rental accommodation.
And that's kind of something.
And that's kind of counterintuitive particularly for the economists. Listen to this, right? That's kind of counterintuitive. Rents are going up, so therefore we supply more rental accommodation. Rents go down. Actually, rents are going up because there's a lot of people in the sector who shouldn't be there.
Yeah, well,
and maybe if we got rid of them, or help them move on.
And that's something I kind of do speak about a lot, because I did a poll on my Instagram and my Twitter, so I went to like 100,000 people, and around, I think it was in between 15 to 20,000 people responded. Now, allowing a margin of error for that, like people responding that maybe
that's more than American, and that's more than American and behaviour and attitudes go out and survey, so it's probably okay.
It's pretty huge. So 96% on my Instagram and 94% on my Twitter of renters said they don't want to rent, they want to own their own home. And I think a lot of those wouldn't mind renting if rent was more affordable, and you had more security. But both of those things are non-existent at the moment. So they wanted to own their own home. So there's none to buy, because, as you said, like I hear it all the time, people are like, all I'm seeing is apartments being built, and I'm surrounded by them as well, but they're not available to buy. But I guess all the funds, the investment funds, do nowadays it's self-declared, but they self-declare that they have like kind of 96% occupancy. Now, I don't know how people are spending $3,500-4,000 grand on 1 and 2 bed apartments, because that's insane. But I guess
there's also a lot of them. There's a lot of them though that have Killian Woods in the Business Post did a story a couple of months ago where he discovered an awful lot of these brand new apartments are they're on like the likes of Airbnb, or they're on short-term letting websites, not available to the punters. And that suggests to me that there isn't really a market there for them. And I know of one building, a brand new built-to-rent building that can't get anybody to go into it. So I suspect that market, at 2 and 3 grand a month, that's out of the reach of most people. Yeah. So your poll is spot on like that. It reflects what I think as well, that the vast if we had houses for sale, people would buy them without a doubt. And the other thing you find, Ellis, is that this kind of normalization of a narrative that, we're just moving towards European norms in the rental sector, and the 20 to 30% is kind of normal. So overall in Ireland, there's probably about 30% of households renting, but 10% of them would be social rental from the council and approved housing bodies, and about 20 21, 22, I don't know what, over 20% of everybody else rents. But you can't say that the numbers are normal and we're normalizing rental, but like without normalizing A, the affordability that people have in Europe, and B, the security of tenure.
Yeah.
So, it's normal for everybody to rent, but hey, hang on a second. We don't want to give you the security of tenure or the affordable rents that they have in Europe. And the eviction, this so-called eviction ban, it's not a ban on evictions. It's a no-fault eviction ban. And actually what it has done up until the end of, the end of March, what it is doing is bringing us in line with with most of Europe in terms of security of tenure. So this idea that your mother-in-law wants your apartment that you're renting out to Kieran, and my mother-in-law wants it. I don't have a mother-in-law, but my hypothetical mother-in-law wants the apartment for some reason. She's moving to Dublin when she gets her hip done or something, and I can ask Kieran and his wife to move. That's nonsense. That wouldn't happen anywhere else in Europe. So the eviction ban has just brought us into line with Europe, and of course then they got rid of it.
Yeah. So the terms of the old eviction ban, because I know people could still have been evicted if they weren't paying their rent or if they're antisocial behaviour or whatever. So
that's always, and I don't have a problem with that, Kieran. I think that's if you're not paying your rent or if you're destroying the place, out you go.
Absolutely. So what you're saying is what that ban was actually just kind of more in line with the laws in other European countries in terms of you can't just be thrown out on a whim. And I know they have more, like it's more common over there to have 10, 15-year leases. And now the other argument is
369 in Belgium and places like, exactly. Or lifetime. If you occupy an apartment, if you rent an apartment for more than 2 years in Denmark, you have a lifetime tenancy.
Wow. I just want to pause the podcast for a moment to talk to you about a company called Beat the Bank. So the stress of organising mortgage protection just got a whole lot easier with beatthebank.ie. This amazing Irish company offers the guaranteed lowest price for mortgage protection in the country, and it's not just for first-time buyers. You can switch your own mortgage protection anytime and enjoy the benefits of their market-leading discounts. I, along with hundreds of my Instagram followers, have used Beat the Bank, and the feedback has been amazing over the last 12 months. With their 100% end-to-end digital experience, quoting and applying for mortgage protection has never been easier. You can get a quote in seconds and apply in minutes, without the hassle of unwanted sales calls or any paperwork. So visit beatthebank.ie today and protect your mortgage with ease and peace of mind. Beat the Bank saves you time and money on mortgage protection, whether you're a first-time buyer or looking to switch. They've also just launched income protection and life insurance on the site too. And if you have a house or are renting and are planning to buy, you need to consider protecting your income. So check out beatthebank.ie. Now, back to the podcast. In those countries then, if loads of people are renting, where is the incentive then for landlords in that country? Like, why would anyone want to be a landlord in that country then if it's so hard, well, if they're not getting that much rent and it's so hard to get rid of somebody if you want it?
Yeah, well, interestingly, the countries with the highest proportion of people who rent, Denmark, Germany, Switzerland, are also the countries with the most highly regulated rental sector and the most strictest security of tenure and the strictest methods for calculating rent, for example. And yet they have the largest rental sector. And in a lot of those countries, the landlords aren't mom and pop landlords, are small, what we call small landlords.
It's a state.
They're the state or their funds or their pension funds or institutional funds or investment funds or their companies or whatever. So you can have it all. And I think what those funds are looking for is just a steady return on income. In Ireland, we squeeze the goodness out of everything. And, the funds coming in theory, were a good idea. Theoretically, if they were going to be affordable, large landlords, bulk buy, they should be able to do things fairly cheaply and therefore the rent should come down. But of course, we didn't do that. And worse than that, they pay no tax on their rental income or capital gains tax when they sell. So, we've kind of got a bit greedy, I think, but we're a very greedy country here anyway, I think.
I think if it was me and I had the option to rent, say, for €1,500, say in around what my mortgage is, to rent a 3-bed house for €1,500, and I could rent that house or apartment off a small landlord, or I could rent it off an investment fund or a pension fund. I'm picking the pension fund all day. Like, they're a far more professional landlord. There's a lot less, if we see kind of the things that Ditch put up, illegal evictions and thugs going in with balaclavas and all the rest. Like, I think that is maybe the one benefit of those institutional investors, is they're a far more professional landlord. But that's assuming that the rents are affordable, but they're not.
Well, for the vast majority of people who rent, an eviction, and particularly goons in balaclavas, isn't going to happen to them. It's a very tiny proportion, particularly when it gets to that level full of goons and balaclavas. For the vast majority of people, a good landlord is a landlord that fixes things when they break, that, you know, is responsive when there's a query and all that kind of stuff. My experience, you know, just discussing this with people who are involved in the sector, is that these large landlords are no better nor no worse, in fairness, than any other landlord. They are as responsive and as are unresponsive as any other landlord, and they get things done in the same time frame as a small landlord. So the theory of them being, you know, big, and I'm sure some of them are brilliant at it, and others, but on balance, my experience and my, you know, albeit anecdotal evidence with people in the sector who are involved in this and property management would say that they're no better and no worse than any other landlord.
Yeah, and that's the thing. The thing is, it's anecdotal, because what I see in my messages is, or even in comments, other things, is from people saying, "Well, I rented from IRES Retail, and they were." I've been renting for 15 years, and they're the best landlord I've had, because they do fix things when, you know. So I guess there's kind of, you know, there's two sides to that.
Oh no, absolutely. No, I'm not saying they're all bad at all.
Yeah,
I'm saying that on you know, on balance, they're landlords, like, you know.
And then I guess if we can kind of touch on, because you made a good point earlier about the number of people in rental accommodation and the amount of them that is are using half housing assistance payment that should be in state supplied social housing, but they're in the private rental sector. So there is a potential there for lots of private rentals to be freed up for sale if there was more state built social housing that people could be put into, rather than these 25-year leases from private landlords. So I think that's a really good point. And in terms of going to the numbers of that, going back to that kind of 30,000 figure and 15,000 kind of scheme houses, which is a lot. I think it's gone up and up the last few years, but not enough, obviously, because we need a lot more. But it always comes back to the fact that there's just not enough available for me to buy. If I need to move, if I need to buy somewhere, there's just not enough there for me to buy, because of that 30,000, so many are either social or apartments for rent or are one-off houses or whatever, which is grand. They're never kind of included anyway. But I guess kind of talk about maybe the figures involved there in terms of social, affordable or whatever, and private.
Well, so out of the 15,000 scheme houses there, like, don't forget, a lot of them are social houses as well. That's only the housing type, if you know what I mean. It's only the type of housing. So a lot of particularly rural local authorities won't build apartments; they'll be building houses.
Yeah.
So out of the 15,000. An awful lot of those are going to be social houses, one way, shape, or form. And then the other thing, the other point that struck me as you're speaking there, is that around 30% of the population are in the rental sector, either social renting, like from a council or a approved housing body, or in the private rental sector. Over half of them are in receipt of some sort of state assistance to help them pay their rent, or else on reduced rent, which is a huge proportion of all renters, you know. So the third point you made there was about supply. We need more housing to buy, and it's good that you nuanced it, because what I hear from particularly politicians, and kind of it's frustrating, that the problem is supply, and the answer is supply, and it's not. And people get annoyed with me when I say this. It's not just about supply, right? So what would happen if 2023 our supply doubled to 50,000 housing units a year, but they were all for rent? So that's no good. So it's about the right type of supply, and this is the critical point that government miss. I said it to Leo Varadkar in January at this housing summit that they organised, I think the 4th of January, and I said I'm really concerned of that, you know, the lack of housing coming to the market to buy, and that the government's targets, we can touch on this in a minute, the government's targets are to have twice as many private rental units as homes to sell between now and 2030. And he turned around and said to me, and I think it was probably because it's just because it was me who asked him, and he's kind of thin-skinned, and he said, like, I don't care what gets built because somebody's going to live in it. And like, it's naive. It's naive socially, it's naive economically, and it's naive politically, because renters in the main aren't going to vote for you, Leo. They're going to vote for someone who's going to be much more kind of renter and tenant friendly, or understands and has a bit more empathy for it. So it is always about the right type of supply. And you know, my figures show that the supply of housing for the vast majority of people who want to own their own homes, has gone down from over half to 28%. And it's not just a question of obsession with home ownership. Our houses are our wealth. This is how we save money in Ireland. You know, I'm sitting in a house that, through no fault of my own, okay, I'm building shells here at the moment, and I put on a little extension at the back or whatever, but it has doubled in value in the last 5 or 6 years. And that's not from me putting on an extension or building a few shells and painting it. It's because the prices that people are paying all around is inflating the value of my property. And you know, that's not really a good thing, but it means that when I subtract whatever's left of my mortgage, which is quite a lot, you know, I'll be a lot wealthier, I would never save that amount of money, for example. So
Yeah.
our houses, it's about 2/3 of our wealth is tied up in our house.
Well, I think that's one of the main issues with housing in Ireland. It is like a pyramid scheme. It's like if you're getting in at the bottom, which is kind of this generation now trying to buy, you are in at the bottom, and it is that kind of wealth that people generate through it. Now, that's only useful if you can sell and keep all that. But if you're selling tomorrow,
Or if you inherit,
yeah,
that's the other biggie in Ireland, and that people don't want to talk about or go near, this idea of, like, most of us will benefit from. It's terrible to think about it, but it's at some stage, for the vast majority of us, we're going to be the last men and women standing, and we'll probably inherit something, whether it's all or half or depending on, and that's a huge contributor to our wealth as well, and most of that will come from housing too.
Yeah. And just on the article that was out a couple of weeks ago about the state and funds that are snapping up 42% of new homes and first-time buyers. You always hear the narrative then against that we have more first-time buyers are buying their own home each year, but that kind of is contradicted then by the fact that near like 42% of all the newly built homes are going to either the state or to funds.
Yeah, I mean, it is true to say that there are more first-time buyers active in the market. Then again, the population has gone up a good bit as well. So they are. I think first-time buyers are up. I can't remember, the up 16 or maybe more 28%, something like that. And that's okay. That's fine. And the first-time buyers are up and all that kind of stuff. But it's more important than that. We need to look at things like it's not just that the number is up. That's a really crude metric. We need to look at where they're buying and what they're buying, right? So what we find, because one government policy is going to contradict another here, right? So what you find is the amount of new housing for sale in Dublin, for example, where you and I both live, is down, I think, 73% in 5 years. So 5 years ago, you and I had a much greater choice when we went to a local estate agent if we wanted to buy a new house. That's down 73%. And the same in Dún Laoghaire, it's down 30%, and so on. All, the same in Galway and same in Cork. Right? But what you find then, where it's up, and I know this is very Dublin-centric, so apologies to listeners who don't really care about Dublin, but it's just a good example. Where you find it's up, so the amount of new housing being bought is down significantly in Dublin City and Dún Laoghaire and all those places. It's up in the Mid-East region, it's up in Kildare, it's up in Meath, it's up in Louth, and it's not just up, it's up 200 and something percent. So what you find is people have less choice in the large urban areas, particularly cities, and they're exercising their right to move, and they're buying because they don't want to rent, and nor can they afford to rent at $2,000 and $3,000 a month, which is the option.
They have to move out.
So they're moving out, and of course what that does, they're moving out. The vast majority of them aren't going to get the train from Kildare to Dublin to work. They're going to buy one car, if not two cars, 10-year-old 3 Series BMWs emitting fumes. The public transport system, typically in a heteronormative household, right? Typically the man goes to the train station, gets on the train or drives there and goes to work. The women in households tend to do the heavy lifting in terms of caring duties. They'll drop the kid to the mother-in-law, to the creche, to the school, and only then will they go to work, right? And because the public transport doesn't suit all that, kind of those short trips, they'll just drive in. So the largest increase in single occupants vehicles coming into Dublin City is women on their own in cars. So now we have our housing policy and our planning policy, because this all comes down to planning, is forcing people into the commuter belt and commuting at the same time as Eamon and Ryan going on about electric vehicles and emissions targets and our fines, and people wanting, active travel, and we need to public transport and blah, 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 blah. And at the back of it all is planning policy forcing people to make those choices. So you have forward gear and reverse gear at the same time, as is pretty much the norm in housing policy.
Yeah,
does that make sense? You're squeezing people in Dublin, and the bubble is just inflating all around Dublin.
Yeah, because they're not really building in Dublin anything that people can buy. It's always for rent.
Well, it's down. It's down 73% or something. New home construction for sale, for the amount of purchases is down. So people are moving. Just what's the phrase about choosing with their feet or whatever? And and a lot of them don't want to. An awful lot of people would like to live. Yeah. They have to, because they want somewhere to own, and of course the mortgage is invariably going to be cheaper than the rent.
Yeah, and the only other option then is to buy from the existing stock, and even that is it's just such large competition then for every house that is in the city. You're competing against other buyers, you're competing against the state, you're competing against investors. So which is why we ended up doing what we did by buying off market, by throwing letters around doors, because we couldn't compete against them all. So
it's a great point, actually. The competition that you have nowadays compared to 5 or 10 years ago is much more. Like 5 or 10 years ago, you and I would be competing against each other to buy a house, right? Now it's you and me versus Dublin Corporation versus an approved housing body versus a fund versus a pension fund versus everybody else, into it. The interesting thing about moving into the second-hand market, so yeah, absolutely, first-time buyers are then forced into the second-hand market, like yourself and myself and all that kind of stuff. But that's first-time buyers. But I went and looked at second-time buyers or third-time buyers, whatever, movers, right? And they're not always people in their 50s with the kids grown up and all that. Quite often, people who bought an apartment in Premier areas and Finglas in their 20s, and they're getting rid of it now, and so they're settling down, and they're still only in their late 30s or whatever, right? And they're a second-time buyer or a former owner-occupier, they call them in the CSO or in the revenue. So when you look at them, their activity is down a lot as well, particularly in urban areas. Now, everything in housing is spatial, right? So their activity overall might be up, but when you break it down spatially, and they're an interesting bunch because typically your movers, your second and third time buyers, they don't have the same money problems as a first time buyer. They have equity built up in the house, they have cash, they have inheritances, whatever, and they tend to borrow a lot less. So a first time buyer will borrow up to the hilt, right? They're borrowing 85, 90% on average of what they need. Second time buyers and movers are borrowing something like 50 odd percent. So they have cash and equity. But their activity is down hugely as well, which would suggest that the product isn't there for them to move to or to buy. So all this kind of the economists love to talk about all these people in big houses and nobody in them except them. They should move to smaller places, etc., etc. There's nothing for them to buy.
Exactly. There's nowhere for them to go. So there are no options. Anyway, our time is running up there, Lorcan. Thank you so much for that. I appreciate it. I will try and put some of the figures together and do a little kind of infographic to go along with this so that people can, after listening, go back and kind of make reference to this is what they were talking about, because I know when you're listening to podcasts it's hard to keep up with numbers and stuff, but as always, thank you so much, Lorcan, for coming on, having a chat.
You're more than welcome, Kieran, and congratulations on the book. It's doing really well.
Thank you, thanks a million. And that is it for today's episode. Massive thank you to Lorcan Sirr for coming on again and chatting with me. He was on for episode 1 of this whole podcast, and it's still to this date the most downloaded episode, and I guess today is just a bit more of an update as to where things are, and unfortunately they don't really seem to be getting any better. But again, massive thank you to Lorcan. Let me know what you guys think. You can contact me on Instagram, you can send me an email. All my details are there on my Instagram page and also in the show notes here, and that is it. So thanks for listening, and again, thank you to the patrons and thank you to the sponsors of the Instagram page and the podcast. I really appreciate it. Agus Slán go fóill.